Hello, welcome to the latest Faithful America webinar. Tonight is the first live episode of a new three-part webinar series called Project 2025 is Project Theocracy, the Christian-Nationalist Roots of Project 2025. My name is the Reverend Nathan Empsall. I am the Executive Director of Faithful America, as well as an Episcopal priest. Now, for those joining us for the first time tonight, Faithful America is the largest online community of grassroots Christians, roughly 200,000 members, putting faith into action for love and social justice, and against the religious rights hijacking of our faith. Our motto is love thy neighbor, no exceptions. To share just one example of our work, the LA Times has credited Faithful America with the inability of Michael Flynn, Pastors for Trump, and their Reawaken America tour to find new venues for their toxic roadshow. As a 501c4, not a church, Faithful America is legally able to organize against the presidential campaign of Donald Trump while continuing to stand against white Christian nationalism in all its forms. Where Jesus teaches love, Christian nationalism preaches hatred and division. Where Jesus says the truth shall set you free, Christian nationalism spreads QAnon lies. And where Jesus is the Prince of Peace, Christian nationalism incites political violence. Now tonight, in a few minutes, I'll be joined in conversation by the wonderful and compelling and brilliant Dr. Kristin Kobes du Mez, author of the New York Times bestselling Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. If you haven't read this book yet, I really recommend it. You should purchase it at bookshop.org. That's a place where independent booksellers get a cut of the profits. So will Faithful America if you use the link that we'll email out and that I'll put in the chat in a few minutes. I also highly recommend reading Kristin's Substack column, Du Mez Connections, and I'll put a link to that in the chat in a few minutes as well. On to tonight. This webinar is the first in our three-part series. Project 2025 is Project Theocracy, the Christian Nationalist Roots of Project 2025. Tonight's installment is called MAGA's Project 2025 is Project Christian Nationalism. Why are we talking about Project 2025? Why is everybody talking about Project 2025? It even came up in the debate earlier this week, along with cats and other things. We're talking about Project 2025 on a Faithful America webinar, and in two more Faithful America webinars, because there is no other topic that so perfectly and quickly sums up two very pressing points. First, the sky-high stakes in this election, an election that is ultimately about joy and democracy versus hatred and theocracy. Second, Project 2025 is a compelling way to talk about the election with our friends, family, and neighbors, to explain the stakes to them and to get them to the polls. Now, we'll hear from Kristin about what is Project 2025 and why is it Christian nationalism in just a minute. But here's the too long did not read version, especially for those who have to leave in just a minute or two if you have to go early tonight. Project 2025 is a 900-page document laying out an authoritarian agenda for the next Republican presidential administration. It was written by current and former top Trump aides, and as well as the Heritage Foundation, and guided by an advisory committee of Christian nationalist organizations. It seeks to expand executive authority and enact a theocratic agenda of ripping away basic freedoms like public education, LGBTQ equality, and abortion access. And I could say a lot more, but Kristin's going to do an even better job than I could. So one other thing I do want to note before I bring in Kristin, this was just really exciting. I saw this earlier today. Some brand new polling out just today shows that sharing about Project 2025's theocratic attacks on our freedom is one of the single best ways to get undecided voters to make up their minds. It's also one of the best ways to get decided voters to the polls, to make sure they actually cast their ballot. I'll share some of that polling a little later tonight. Now, the last thing before I introduce Kristin, I want to make two announcements. First, because I know it's the question we're going to get asked the most, yes, we are recording this webinar tonight. We will send out YouTube and Facebook links tomorrow to everyone who registered. We'll also be taking your questions later in the hour. Please feel free to use the Q&A box down there in the doobly-doo to share your questions with Kristin and myself as we go along. Type them whenever you have them. We'll get to them at the end, but you can raise them as you have them. Again, don't use the chat box, use the box marked Q&A. Second, I do now have the dates and panelists for parts 2 and 3 of this series. We said in the email inviting you to this that we would announce those parts tonight, and I'll share that information later in the hour. I will also put that info in the same email that goes out tomorrow, that includes the link to this video. That email will also include all the links I'll be putting in the chat throughout the night. Finally, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our special guest tonight. Dr. Kristin Kobes du Mez is a New York Times best-selling author and professor of history and gender studies at Calvin University. Her most recent book is New York Times bestseller, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation. She holds a PhD from the University of Notre Dame, and her research focuses on the intersection of gender, religion, and politics. She has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, NBC News, Religion News Service, and Christianity Today, and has been interviewed by NPR, CBS, and the BBC, among other outlets. One of those outlets is PBS. Now, I've been wanting to bring Kristin onto a Faithful America webinar for some time. I knew it had to be this one after seeing her a few weeks ago on PBS's Amanpour and Company in a special 18-minute segment called Project 2025 Will Redefine the Constitution in the Name of Christianity. Kristin, thank you so much for joining us. You are wonderful, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be here with you tonight, and to be with all of you who have joined in. I have to say that I like talking about Project 2025. Maybe not all 900 pages of it on a Thursday evening, but the reason I like talking about it is because I find it somewhat refreshing that we are focused on policy, that we are focused on not on the whatever shenanigans are happening in any given moment. We're not even talking about identity or kind of cultural factors, although as a cultural historian, I think those are very important. It's refreshing to have policy centered in our conversation about what matters in the upcoming election and what matters for the future of our country. As a scholar and as a citizen, I had almost come to despair that ideas didn't really matter anymore. And yet here we are, Project 2025, ideas do seem to matter. And here we have 900 pages of ideas spelled out with great clarity, telling the country what to expect if Trump wins the White House again. Although that statement right there is contested. If you've been paying any attention, if you watched the debate this week, you'll know that Trump says he has no idea what's in Project 2025. Barely heard of it, right? Certainly didn't read it, isn't going to read it, no idea what y'all are talking about. So let's start there. Does Project 2025 have anything to do with Trump? He didn't write it. I don't know if he's read it. I don't know if he reads much of anything. So is this just a liberal or Democratic smear tactic to try to pin all of these unpopular proposals, many of them are extremely unpopular, pin it on Trump? No, there's a reason that Project 2025 is tightly connected to the next Trump administration. If we have a next Trump administration, we have around 140 former members of Trump's administration, first time around, who have participated in this project. The whole purpose of this document is to give a detailed playbook to hand to Trump. One of the regrets first time around of Trump and his loyalists was that they were not ready to hit the ground running. And Project 2025 exists to remedy that situation. So detailed playbook. Also worth noting that this is not the first time the Heritage Foundation has come out with a mandate for leadership. They've been doing this since Reagan. But this one's a little bit different. I should also say that Heritage had a plan for Trump's first administration. Those first weeks, months were chaotic, but even then, they assessed that around 60% of their policy proposals were in fact implemented the first time around. This one's a little bit different because it contains not just the set of policy proposals, although it does contain those and in great detail. It also contains a vision, a plan to really overhaul the federal government and to increase executive power. So when we look at those policies that are part of this handbook, we have to understand that they go hand in hand with the plan to enhance executive power. There's also a kind of conservative linked in, a personnel database that's a part of this big plan as well. And they need that because to enhance executive power, the key plan there is to essentially purge the federal government of anyone deemed insufficiently loyal to Trump and his agenda. So that was one of the problems they identified: lack of organization, hitting the ground running. And Trump himself has blamed disloyal appointees and members of the federal government, civil servants, with failing to carry out his agenda. And so they want to fix that problem going forward. So their plan is to purge maybe 10, maybe 20, maybe 50,000 federal workers across different agencies across the government, and actually do away with some of the agencies like the Department of Education, and install Trump loyalists, including in places like the Department of Justice. So one facet of this is essentially to weaponize the Department of Justice. This goes along with exactly what Trump is saying he wants to do, right? He wants to use his power, if he's president again, to go after his enemies, to go after anyone he deemed disloyal, including members of his first administration. So we have to understand Project 2025, both in terms of the agenda and into the policy agenda, and then also in terms of enhancing executive power, essentially saying Trump is in charge of the entire federal government, or whoever that president may be, but this is a handbook that they are planning to hand to Trump himself. So what does this have to do with Christian nationalism? Here, it's helpful to understand some of the key authors, drafters involved in this project, particularly a man by the name of Russell Vought. Now, Russell Vought was a member, like so many of other contributors, a member of the first Trump administration. He is Trump's former director of the Office of Management and Budget. He also happens to be the author of the chapter on executive power in Project 2025. Russ Vought is also a self-proclaimed Christian nationalist, and he has ties to a number of other Christian nationalist leaders spread across an array of different denominations, Protestant denominations. So he'll appear on stage with them, he's networked, and he's connected. And so that's a really important connection right there. Many also suggest that Russ Vought may be handpicked to serve as Trump's next chief of staff. So despite these declarations of innocence, I know nothing about this, the connections really are quite tight. We could talk about Kevin Roberts as well, and his connection in particular to J.D. Vance. Vance wrote the foreword to Roberts's new book, which should have been out by now or right about now. But when word leaked about the contents of that book and they saw the damage it was doing to the Trump campaign because of the radical proposals in that book, that has now been delayed, released until after the election. The subtitle of that book, until they changed it, was Burning Down Washington to Save America. Kevin Roberts is the president of the Heritage Foundation and helped oversee this entire project. I should also say that Trump has praised the Heritage Foundation as before all of this kind of scandal around Project 2025 emerged, before people actually read what was in it and became alarmed. He praised the Heritage Foundation and called it a great group that would, and I quote, lay the groundwork and detailed plans for exactly what our movement will do when the American people give us a colossal mandate to save America. So it looked like they were at least on the same page, if not fully in cahoots. And I think we could expect that if Trump does win the White House, if all of these proposals may not necessarily pass, but they will at least all be on the table, and we should expect a large number of them to be implemented. Okay, so again, this the idea that this is a policy handbook, right, and that a think tank would provide that, that's not that unusual. But this link to completely restructuring the federal government to enhance executive power, that is. And there are also some rather extreme iterations of these policies that are proposed. And it is an expansive document, right? So we have policies proposed on slashing regulations, kind of typical conservative economic policies, slash corporate and personal income taxes, at least among the wealthy, and reduce federal spending on the poor. And with regard to climate change, repeal clean energy subsidies, unleash oil and natural gas production, roll back environmental regulations. Again, eliminate the Department of Education and have voucher-like options instead of public schooling, and student loan forgiveness. And then we also have a number of conservative social issues that are a part of this. Restrict access to the abortion pill, and insurance coverage for the week after contraceptive pill, and require states to report where women seeking abortions live, outlaw pornography. And the document actually links pornography to transgender ideology and to the sexualization of children, right? So all of that is kind of part of this as well. And here's where you can see some of this kind of Christian nationalist foundation, particularly in some of these social issues. But I think the key places I was reading through this document where I saw evidence of the Christian nationalist underpinnings was in a particular quote about the founders. And when the founders spoke of the pursuit of happiness, what they actually meant was the pursuit of blessedness. And they say that the founders granted, and the Constitution grants, the liberty not to do what we want, but to do what we ought. And as a scholar who has studied Christian nationalism, right, this rings alarm bells to me. To the rights in the Constitution guarantee us the right to do what we ought, not what we want. Well, what are the things that we ought to do? This is this Christian nationalist framing. And they will tell you what you ought to do, aligning with their conservative and reactionary political and theological values. So within this framework, there is no right, certainly not to abortion. LGBTQ rights do not exist. They cannot exist because of their understanding of this kind of mythical understanding of the Christian, the origins of Christian America, this kind of myth of Christian America. Yes, there were Christians among the founders, but we know that the founding documents and the Constitution were remarkably secular documents for their time. Right? The Constitution stipulated the separation of church and state coming out of the era of religious wars, and set up a government that protected freedom of religion and freedom to not practice religion, that stipulated there would be no establishment of religion, right? Remarkable in its day, and has shaped the government up till now. And that is what is being eroded here with the Christian nationalist myth, which suggests that no, the Constitution established a distinctly Christian nation. Some will even go so far as to say it was inspired directly by God. And when they say it established a distinctly Christian nation, then any interpretation of the Constitution must therefore align with their understanding of God's laws. That's how they understand it. And so to restore Christian America means to interpret the Constitution and to build the nation's laws around God's laws, which are their particular versions of God's laws. So you're not going to see, God's laws being interpreted in terms of issuing a jubilee, right, and forgiving debts every 50 years, or mandating that we welcome all the strangers, or that we love our neighbors as ourselves, or that we turn the other cheek, right? Those biblical teachings aren't part of this understanding of Christian nationalism. Instead, it's going to be interpreted in terms of free market capitalism, anti-LGBTQ, and traditional family, often patriarchy is a part of that, and so on and so forth. Right, so this is really the interpretive schema of the Constitution, and this is the framework that this is meant to impose. Now, the problem is that historically speaking, right, this is not how the Constitution has always been interpreted. And also, many Americans, the majority of Americans, do not support Christian nationalism. They do not. We have all kinds of survey data here. And that's a problem. And that's the problem that Project 2025 in its grand vision is set up to fix. And here's how we can understand this affinity between Trump with his authoritarian leanings and the Christian nationalist movement. It is clear to them that they do not have the numbers to achieve their goals through purely democratic means, right? And we've seen this kind of escalation of rhetoric and a reactionary movement within conservative Christian spaces and conservative evangelical spaces over the last decade or so, or two, as we start to really confront these demographic changes, what Robert Jones has called the end of white Christian America. Right? Conservative evangelicals or Christian nationalist folks are familiar with those numbers. They are well aware. And that is why they are trying to use the mechanisms that they currently have in order to seize control and ensure that they maintain control of this government. Right, and this is key to understanding Project 2025 and the enhancement of that executive power, replacing bureaucrats who are just trying to do their job with Trump loyalists. And then what comes next? What is on the other side of this? That is the question, right? They want to completely restructure the government and restructure the country. And this is where Kevin Roberts said, essentially achieve a second American revolution, which will be bloodless if the left allows it to be. If the left allows it to be. So those are frightening words here. And so you can take any number of issues that are included in Project 2025 and talk about those, but really you have to talk about this big picture. And again, it heartens me that many Americans are deeply concerned about the big picture. I know that I've seen survey data over the past months and the last couple of years that democracy isn't necessarily a term that inspires voters and is not necessarily the best mobilizing concept. But it heartens me that in this case, it does seem to be that people are concerned about particular policy proposals, but they are deeply concerned about this broader agenda, which is designed, crafted to work against a pluralist society, to really ensure a Christian supremacist approach to government, and then make sure that that cannot be undone going forward. And so it is something that we ought to pay careful attention to. Despite Trump's protests that he has nothing to do with it, I should also add that Kevin Roberts helped to, or Russ Vogt, I believe it was, helped to actually author the Republican Party platform, right? So even here, and Trump had a very clear hand in that. It reads like a lot of his tweets. string of his tweets. So that connection is very tight. And the real connection there is not even around any particular policy issue. It is around power. And it is around granting unrestrained power, unprecedented power to the next president, if that president is Donald Trump. So I'll leave it at that and then take some of your questions, and we'll see where this goes.
Thank you, Kristin. I love all of that. I really appreciate it. I hate all of it, but I also love it all. I really appreciate all that. I'm so glad you ended on that note too about power, because ultimately, and that phrase Christian supremacy, because that's ultimately what this is about. Christian nationalists are Christian, but Christian nationalism is not. It's a political ideology to seize power for just a few, despite what Jesus told Satan in Luke 4 about, that's not what I'm here for. I want to ask you a couple follow-up questions and maybe talk about a couple things. And to everyone watching, thank you. Please put your questions in the Q&A box if you haven't already, and we can ask a couple in a minute here. You talked about Russell Vogt and some of the others who are close to Trump who wrote this. Could you talk about some of the names that we'll know from the advisory committee? Because where there is James Dobson and Tony Perkins, there is Christian nationalism.
Yes, yes. So you're right. I didn't mention all of these. We have advisory committee. We have it's a growing list of conservative organizations who have either contributed to or signed on. And this is really key too. This is where you can definitely catch the Christian nationalist flavor here. So yes, we have James Dobson's Family Institute is a part of this. Liberty University is a part of this. Patrick Henry College is a part of this. Alliance Defending Freedom, Concerned Women of America. It really is a who's who list of conservative and conservative Christian organizations. So in many ways, this is the Christian right that has been around, right, since the 1970s, and with roots going back even deeper than that. So there's something very familiar here. This is not just a renegade or movement, right? Although it also is that, right? And so what we see in Project 2025 here is kind of the coalescing of the old Christian right, that we're very familiar with, the Dobson, the ADF, the Liberty, the Falwell types, right? That group, firmly with Trump's inner circle and with Trump himself, and with a list of ideas and a plan for implementation. And I should say that the full plan for implementation is not actually public. They kept some of this back, and understandably so. And it should be telling that the 900 pages that they released, they didn't realize how provocative and how damaging that would be. But this is the old guard Christian right, and all of that massive infrastructure and funding coming alongside Trump and his inner circle, and they all have their eyes on the White House.
There's one of the groups in particular that I don't think has gotten enough attention, but to me really nails that connection between Christian nationalism and Trump and now Project 2025. Are you familiar? You've been reading about America First Legal and their reaction to Kennedy v. Bremerton when that came out a couple of years ago?
So you're going to have to fill me on the Kennedy Bremerton there.
So America First Legal is one of the reason I really want to ram home like who's on this advisory committee is Project 2025 seems to go to great lengths to hide its theocratic agenda, its Christian nationalist agenda, and look like just another Heritage Foundation Republican document like they do every 4 years. They mention the Bible in the anti-LGBTQ section. Beyond that, the policies are clearly the ones about power and who they're from, and our policies often only held by the religious right for religious reasons, but they don't spell that religious piece out in the document. And even when you look at the advisory committee, so many of the groups, oh, it's just another Republican group. America First Legal is one of those groups, but it's more than that. So it was started by, it's a law firm, a legal advocacy group like Alliance Defending Freedom, started by Stephen Miller and oh gosh, I'm blanking on long COVID brain, the last White House chief of staff, Meadows. Stephen Meadows,
Mark Meadows, yes.
Right. And Meadows isn't close to Trump the way he used to be. Miller isn't just a former Trump aide. He's still in Trump's inner circle. He'll be back. And he's the racist who is to blame for family separation, for the Muslim ban, for ending DACA, for all of Trump's racist immigration policies. When Miller and Meadows started this group, Trump put out a press release praising, or a quote in their press release praising it. So a direct line to Trump. Here's why I bring it up, because it looks like another Republican group. When the Supreme Court, and they're on the advisory committee, right next to Family Research Council and all those groups, when the court allowed the football coach Kennedy to pray on the 50-yard line of a public school football game, America First Legal put out a statement, and they said, let me find the exact quote. The Supreme Court's ruling today made clear that the Establishment Clause must be interpreted. No, this isn't the right sentence. Sorry. AFL is hopeful that the justices will build on this ruling and eventually disincorporate the Establishment Clause, which fully protects the rights of states to decide whether and what extent they will establish religion within their borders. In other words, Trump's top racist immigration advisor, now one of the bigwigs behind Project 2025, is saying, hey, we know the federal government can't create an established church, but the 50 states can. You can declare religion, the established religion in each state, and that's what we want the Supreme Court to do. So that's the kind of level of power and attack on your religious freedom that ultimately Project 2025's authors are designing it to do.
Absolutely. And it is, since you mentioned Stephen Miller, let's talk about the anti-woke agenda here. Very explicit throughout Project 2025, interlinked with that Christian nationalist agenda. You really can't separate these. So there are all sorts of policy proposals in this document to attack, quote unquote, woke ideology. They have a whole list of terms that they want to cancel. So kind of no government materials can use phrases like reproductive health. And even to talk about, I think, systemic justice or systemic racism, right? These kinds of concepts, they just want to like get rid of the words. You can't even talk about these concepts in any federal administration, right? Any group, you just can't, any policies, any recommendations. And so they're really pushing back against this woke, quote unquote, woke ideology. The other thing that I want to add in terms of Christian nationalism here, which is, I mean, it's so obvious that I didn't mention it, but at the heart of Christian nationalism is an us versus them ideology. And it identifies fellow Americans as enemies, as threats to real America, to Christian America. And those threats are everybody who does not fall in line with their agenda. Other Christians are actually a huge threat. And you'll see some of the worst vitriol from some of these folks in Christian nationalist spaces is aimed at their fellow Christians, who are very dangerous to them, precisely because they disrupt this notion that you're either with us or against us, and God is on our side, and we are God's people, and everybody else is an enemy of God. And Christians themselves who are speaking against this are the most dangerous, so they often really bear the brunt of this. But also that anti-woke, kind of the same thing. It's instituting an entirely new kind of coerced orthodoxy that aligns with their agenda on every single item.
It's that us versus them mindset. I avoided using the term fascism for so long until I read the book by Jason Stanley, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us versus Them, I think was the name. So I was looking for it on this bookshelf. It's not here. But it's that us versus them mindset that is inherent in politics, and we don't want to become inherent in government. And that's why at Faithful America, we make a point of saying Christian nationalism is not Christian, but Christian nationalists are. We don't want to join them in questioning anybody's faith. We're just going to look at the fruits there and call them back to loving their neighbor and try to heal that us versus them piece a little bit. But part of us versus them, like you said earlier, it's all about power. And Project 2025 is about policy, but it's also about how to implement the policy, the what, but also the how. And you talked about part of it, the authoritarianism, the increasing executive power. And part of that is stripping so many bureaucratic officials of their government protections by making them political appointees who can get fired if they ever utter one of those woke phrases. And another part of that that I don't think is getting enough attention is the resume bank. Because even if Donald Trump's never heard of this, even if he never touches it, the agenda of any administration is implemented by thousands of people who maybe get a photo op with the president when they leave, but otherwise never meet him. And Heritage is trying to staff the Trump administration so that he doesn't have to care about Project 2025. It's implemented by those folks anyway. Can you talk about the resume bank and those non-report pieces, but all the actual action pieces?
Yeah, if you're going to purge tens of thousands of government bureaucrats, you need to fill those with loyalists. And you need to train some of these loyalists because a lot of the people who have the skills to run the government aren't going to be on board, right? They're not loyal enough, and they're the ones who are targeted to be purged. And so there's this database where you can take like kind of video training courses. And I've watched a couple of them, and they're just essentially indoctrination videos where you with also some skills added, right? So they're trying to kind of groom a workforce and train them so that they can hit the ground running when they purge all of our current government employees across the federal bureaucracy. So and this is how we're looking at this kind of fundamental restructuring of what happens when you put these loyalists in these key places, and tens of thousands of them, because one of the real guardrails that did hold, and not all of them did, guardrails that did hold with Trump's first administration was that there are a number of people filling all sorts of government positions who had integrity, regardless of their political party, and they were trying to do their jobs with integrity, right? And those are the people who are targeted for removal. And there are other mechanisms too that we haven't mentioned here in terms of government spending, in terms of who has the power over that. And all of it is really kind of taking this power that is distributed and meant to be kind of dispersed in a nonpartisan way. I mean, carrying forward the kind of congressional dictates, and to bring it into the unitary executive, to just really take all of that power from across the entire executive branch and put it all in the hands of the commander-in-chief, the president, if that's President Trump.
Thank you. So I want to share two things, and then I'll turn to the audience questions for you. First, the question we're always going to get about anything we talk about is, what can I do? And we're going to have a one-page toolkit coming out in the next few days, some very basic, simple actions. So I don't have that link yet, but I have a couple of things to just name. The first is simple, which of course is to vote and to get everyone to vote. The second thing, and that's not just true at the federal level, because, and we're going to talk about this more Monday night, Project 2025 is also a blueprint for state legislatures. I mean, there's so much here that's going to keep happening at the state level. I voted in a primary for state representative a couple weeks ago that was decided by 2 votes. Unfortunately, it was not my wife and my vote, because it went in the other direction, but still 2 votes. So vote in every single line on that ballot, learn the races, and vote. We'll have a new statement from Faithful America. Call it a petition if you'd like to sign and share, to show the press how many, that there is widespread Christian opposition to Project 2025, that it does not speak for our faith. I could share the link with the old statement now that asked Republican presidential candidates in the primaries to reject Project 2025. That was signed by about 15,000 Christians, but we'll have a new one in the next week or two as well that you can add your name to. But what I really want to encourage people to do is to talk about this. And if you're a faith leader, you can preach about this. Do not ever, from the pulpit or using church resources, endorse or oppose a candidate or a party, but you can educate on the issues. You can talk about the stakes. You can talk about the church's values. Remember that the Heritage Foundation, like a church, is a 501c3. So in a church, do not tell people who to vote for or against, but you can say, look, You're going to hear a lot of talk about religion in the election. Obviously, we talk about religion here. I want you to know what our values are, what the stakes in this are, why it's important to vote. You're hearing about this thing called Project 2025. Here's what it says. Those are the stakes in this election. They don't line up with our values. Please vote. That the IRS says that's a perfectly fine message. So please preach on this. The other thing, if you're not a preacher, still talk about it. And this is the second point I want to make. There's, Kristen, I don't know if you saw this. There's some brand new polling out today from the Global Strategy Group. This was paid for by, the poll was paid for by End Citizens United, but it was conducted by the pollsters at GSG. And I'm just going to read here. They say, there is clear political benefit to talking about Project 2025. In battleground House districts, a generic Democrat has a 4-point lead over a generic Republican for Congress. But when the choice is between an anti-Project 2025 Dem and a Project 2025 Republican, Democratic lead goes from 4 points to 18. By a 68 to 23% margin, voters who are familiar with Project 2025 are more likely to think that it would be harmful rather than helpful. 75% say the word extreme describes it. 73% say authoritarian. 70% say dangerous. And information about Project 2025 does a better job of motivating Democratic voters to turn out than 3 traditional negative messages about Republicans do. So this is turning people against those who support it, and it's getting people who already think that way to say, yeah, I'm going to go vote. And the last thing I'll note, even though Trump's trying to distance himself from Project 2025, 75% of voters closely associate it with him. 79% believe he supports it. So there's even a margin there that say, no, he has nothing to do with it, but he still supports it. 78% also believe that Republicans in Congress support it. So this doesn't just define the stakes, as everything Kristen laid out. It really is motivating voters. It really is explaining the stakes, not just highlighting them. It's motivating people. So please talk about that. Kristen, I've got a question or two lined up to share with you, but I don't know if you want to respond to that poll data at all first.
Oh, I mean, again, it's heartening to me. It's heartening that we can talk about real issues that really matter. And and I would add too that if as another talking point, if people say, well, no, Trump said, he has nothing to do with it. Let them know that Kevin Roberts, after a few weeks ago, when Trump tried to disavow, he said basically like, don't worry about it, guys. Right? We know that it's not popular in this election season, so just sit tight. And it's here when he needs it, and like, we're all good here, we're all good. So Kevin Roberts had a high level of confidence that his protestations were simply a political move. And clearly this has been the most damaging kind of weapon, if you will, very legitimate weapon in this election season, and rightly so. And again, this is not about kind of traditional partisan politics. And it's not about differing views on the size of government or on any particular policy. This fundamentally does speak to the resilience, even endurance of our democracy.
So let's turn to some questions from the 500 or so folks who have joined us tonight. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. TR. I love this. It says, please address Project 2025 and its connection to patriarchy as it continues the deep oppression and hatred of all women.
So there are some lines in it about various different lines about kind of biblical roles and biblical teachings about family, and coming from the spaces where it's coming from, right? That's a kind of patriarchal order. It has language about a kind of male-female dyad. And so very clear, right? There are 2 genders and only 2 genders, and that the government ought to support and promote that. There's a line that children have a right to be raised in a family with a mother and a father, right? Now, what does that mean? What would that look like? If this is a kind of wish list, what kinds of policies might follow with respect to gay marriage, with respect to adoption, with respect to all sorts of things that we kind of take for granted as protected rights today, could fundamentally undermine those. Oh, I should add too, and then we could, for many voters as well, the issue of abortion and women's rights is addressed to a certain extent in there. It does not say it would ban all abortion, right? It's more smaller steps in terms of restricting access to mifepristone, abortion pill, and also restricting access to some contraceptive pills, and interestingly also words about re-invoking the Comstock Act going back to the early 20th century, which prohibits mailing of contraceptive devices. And so in terms of women's reproductive freedom, there are a number of places where that is addressed in this document as well.
Another question comes from Sarah. How does the document address religions other than evangelical Christianity?
Yeah, it doesn't, and I'd have to go back. So I read much of this a couple of months ago, and so I'm kind of dusting off some notes here. So I will speak not in terms of direct quotes as I'm pulling out in other places, but the general ethos, which is I think I use the term Christian supremacy here. And I should say it doesn't generally use the language evangelical either. And that's very typical of this kind of Christian nationalist framing, which is, it's not distinctively evangelical. They would simply like to call it Christian or biblical, right? And so it's this kind of default generic, and there's real power in framing it in that way. And so where do other religions come in? It will be fine as long as you do not interfere with this order. As long as you can live under this order, this kind of Christian America, and not disrupt this their plans. And if you can find your place in this order, you will be welcome here. But you need to find your place within their order, which is based on their idea of the God-ordained order, biblical law.
I'll add to that. If I recall, speaking of, so much of this movement, Project 2025 and beyond, like you say, means one specific kind of Christianity when they talk about Christianity. So it's clearly an attack on pro-choice Christians and mainline Protestants. Franklin Graham says progressive Christianity will lead you to hell, direct quote. It's an attack on progressive Catholics. But more than that, I recall, you've read all 900 pages, I haven't, but in one of the summaries I read, it said that, referring back to COVID-19 and the closure of houses of worship, it advocates for protections for churches, but specifically uses the word church, not house of worship. It doesn't seem to cover, the courts would probably strike it down, but you never know. It doesn't cover mosques or temples or synagogues or anything like that. Does it bring back the Muslim ban, even under another name?
Oh, I no, the Muslim ban is not a part of this. I believe I'd have to fact check that, but in looking at some misconceptions around it, kind of the full Muslim ban is not a part of this document. However, then you can see what's in this document, and then what folks who have contributed to this document and participated in this have said elsewhere. And I think that's where you could get into more of that territory. So there's different kind of layers here, but I have to fact check me on that. But I do not believe the explicit Muslim ban is part of Project 2025.
I appreciate that, because there's a lot of misinformation about what is in Project 2025, because there's so much garbage that the people behind it have been advocating for. It's easy, a lot of articles out there saying it's in the document when it isn't. So that's, like, we know Stephen Miller behind Project 2025, behind the Muslim ban, but it's not in this document. But we know that there's that kind of language and approach to non-Christian religions that just do lose their clear religious freedom.
And
Well,
certainly anti-immigration policies, right, that align very closely with the Republican Party platform as well. Mass deportations and so on. And of course, there's some overlap there with non-Christian religions or perceived so, and anti-immigration sentiments. So certainly you can find that in the document.
and so much of the abortion passages too clearly will have an impact on those Jewish communities and teachings that say in cases of threats to the mother, there are times when an abortion may be required under those religious rules. So to ban Judaism from practicing Judaism is clearly anti-Semitic.
I mean that kind of framework, even the very kind of language that you're using here is language that would you're not going to hear in those spaces in the same way, right? Because they're approaching this very much with this narrow vision of their agenda equals Christianity equals the kind of true American agenda, right? This whole, so we talk about different kinds of Christianities or multi-faith, that just really is not a part of this. But over and over again, you're going to come across language about, imposing like biblical order and these biblical structures, and that really is Christian nationalism to a T. Where in a pluralist society, yes, we should talk about what about kind of freedom for Jewish people to live according to their what their faith dictates. That doesn't have a place in the Christian nationalist framework, right? This is anti-pluralist. It is fundamentally anti-democratic, because the way that they understand all issues is what is God's law, right? God's law. And they will tell you what God's law is in every circumstance. And then their understanding is that if we as a country do not obey God's law, if we do not structure our laws according to God's laws, we will not receive God's blessing. And this is kind of the Make America Great Again, right? We have lost God's blessing, or we have lost our way. We have gone astray, and it is time to take back the country. So you can see how it resonates so well with Trump's own rhetoric. Make America Great Again, take back our country, right? And so it is to just retake America and place it, restructure according to God's plan. And then the takeaway is, then you will be blessed. We will be blessed. So this is how you get to, it is for your own good, right? It is for your own good to be coerced into obeying the laws that we pass, because our country will be blessed and you will be blessed. Again, the pursuit of blessedness, not happiness, the right to do what you ought, not what you discern, not what you want. Certainly not if you are outside of our agenda, what you would like to vote for.
One of the questions that's come up in several different wording several different times is, okay, yeah, so that's why these leaders want this, it's going to get them power, but how are they suckering everyday Christians into believing this, following it? And I think something you said is so key. We're talking about this in terms of how it harms pluralism, how it harms our neighbors who are different than us. And you said, you're not going to hear that language in these other circles. It's all about what it does for them and God's blessing, God's law. It's framed in such a positive way. We have a mutual friend in Doug Paget, Pastor Doug Paget of O Common Good. Doug says that one of the ways he's gotten some people just to rethink Christian nationalism is by asking them, why do you like it? Why do you want a Christian nation? Oh, because Christianity is good. So you want power just for Christians? Sure, not for your Jewish friends. Well, I didn't mean not for your Buddhist friends. Well, what about, it's when we start saying, do you realize how this hurts these people we love? They'd never thought of it in those negative terms, only what was in it for. It's not that they are trying to hurt people. They just only thought about the pro of the side of the pro-con list.
That is certainly part of it. And then there's a darker side as well, which is in many of these Christian communities for decades now, their leaders have told them that they are under threat, that they are under attack. It was, going back to the 70s, the secular humanists. And then it was the feminists and the leftists and the communists and radical Islam, and then the gay agenda and the Democrats, right? There's always an enemy, and this is just how that works, because if you can create fear, it's a really great way to build a movement. It's a really great way to consolidate power. It's a really great way to drive donations. And this has just been, this is kind of one of the through lines of Jesus and John Wayne. It is, stoking these fears. And then the fears are real. People are really afraid about what's going to happen to their family, to their children, to their right to worship. Right? You will hear this over and over and over again in conservative Christian spaces, from Christian radio, Christian media, right? That the government is coming for you, for your children. You cannot practice your faith, this apocalyptic, right? Dark vision. And therefore, because the threats are so great, you have to seize power. You have to seize power while you still can, because they are coming for you, right? So there's this justification. And I know a lot of people are very afraid. If you are only kind of taking in conservative media in those echo chambers and hearing over and over again, it feels very threatening, especially if you don't have a lot of contact in some of these conservative Christian spaces. The communities are established so that you don't have a lot of interaction. Christian school, homeschool, your social group is your church group, right? And so what's really helpful is, the examples that you were giving. Wait, what about your non-Christian friend? What about your neighbor? What about me in this? And just reminding people, but also you need to have those relationships to be able to ask those questions, right? You need to build those relationships and remind people that the rhetoric that they've been fed, this fear that has been really just instilled in their communities, it doesn't really map onto their lived experience. It really doesn't, right? That this is a kind of propaganda to make them afraid, to drive the polarization. And when you look around you in your daily life, we actually get along pretty well. I was struck by this. I fly a lot these days, and I'm in airports a lot. And sure, you hear your airport horror stories and they make it to Twitter and social media every once in a while. But honestly, it struck me that I fly a whole lot, and I generally have relatively pleasant and sometimes very sweet interactions with almost anybody I meet. Even when we're tired and on business travel and all of these things, we're fine in our neighborhoods. We don't always know, at the grocery store, in general, we're just wishing well for other folks, and we can get along pretty well with each other. And that America, right? You're not going to encounter in these Christian nationalist spaces, that vision of America. It's, again, always the us versus them instead of the common good, always us versus them. And you just have to find ways to show that that's actually not accurate. That's propaganda. That's not who we are. It really isn't.
The only, to use a phrase I hate, illegal alien you've ever seen trying to eat a cat is a brown furry one from an 80s sitcom, Alf. So why do you believe Donald Trump and JD Vance and Ted Cruz when they are telling you otherwise?
It's such dangerous rhetoric too, right? We should just call that out. It is such dangerous rhetoric. You mentioned Jason Stanley's book on fascism. When I was in graduate school, my outside field was 20th century Germany and the German Christian movement and genocide studies. And for those of us who are familiar with that literature, we know that this demonization and dehumanization is always the first step towards actual violence. And Christians of all people ought to fight against that dehumanization of fellow image bearers, right? And yet, so often in this country, Christians are on the leading edge of dehumanizing their neighbors, of dehumanizing their fellow citizens, of dehumanizing often the least of these.
And what we as Christians ought to be doing is looking for the image of God in all humans, every single one. I had two questions I wanted to pull from the Q&A box, and you just hit the next one. I had a couple people asking about the Deutsche Christian and Germany in the 1930s, and you just nailed that. So the last question I want to bring up from the Q&A, and then I'll share about our upcoming webinars, and then we'll talk about your new movie, and we'll wrap it up for the night. I'm not sure what the actual question here is, but there's a pattern. A lot of people have said, is this related to the Christian Reconstructionists? Is this related to Seven Mountains Dominionism? Is Turning Points USA and Charlie Kirk behind this with their TPUSA Faith offshoot? How is this related to Mike Flynn or the NAR, the New Apostolic Reformation? All these groups we keep hearing about on Straight White American Jesus or elsewhere that together make up the realist right. Everyone is picking a different piece of that network and asking in the Q&A, how are they linked to this?
I love this composite question. It is exactly the right question that we have to ask. Yes, 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 and yes to all of those, right? And this is how this works. And this is why several months ago, you mentioned my Substack, and I wrote a piece called The Thickening Webs of the Christian Right several months ago. And it was around, I think it was around Project 2025, if I recall right. And in the coalitions that we saw, that to those of us who observe these spaces were chilling. Right, I mentioned already we had kind of this old guard Christian right and then the Trump folks, but what we see happening, the Christian right today is not just the Falwell, Robertson types, although we still have those. Christian Reconstructionism, absolutely. To those of you who know what we're talking about there, we can trace that through many of these networks. Much more so, I'm working on a kind of future research project that's tracing kind of going deeper into the history of these networks. And Christian Reconstructionism is so much more prominent than people actually influenced by Christian Reconstructionism want to let you believe. Right, this has been this movement that's often kind of just underneath the surface, but it shaped Howard Phillips, the Council for National Policy. We can see it in Doug Wilson and all the stuff he has going on in his little Christian nationalist enclave in Idaho. And then, yes, let's talk about the New Apostolic Reformation and Seven Mountains Mandate, and we can trace back there too roots to Rushdoony. And we have this massive movement that if you're not tuned in, you're probably completely oblivious to, except sometime, on national news, you'll see somebody blowing a shofar or something, and, and like just weird. It seems so weird. It's like, who even are these people? And then you change the channel. But no, this is a massive movement drawing in millions of people and tens of millions of people, and globally, I think we're into probably hundreds of millions now. I have to check with Matthew Taylor on that, right? These movements. And so you've got all of these different strands, varieties of Christian nationalism, histories, traditions kind of coming together. And then what you see is they're all hanging out together. They're on stage together at NatCon, TPUSA right in the mix here, right? Linked into the Trump administration, linked into the Southern Baptist Convention and the Conservative Baptist Network, linked through all of these denominations. And Project 2025 really is just kind of the tip of the iceberg in terms of these vast networks that are setting aside whatever differences they have. And I mean, if you actually want to think theologically, there are enormous differences, theological differences among these folks. That doesn't matter. Where we see as they're uniting around this common political vision, and it is one of seizing power. Now, the question remains what they're going to do if they actually get it, because there are so many egos in those rooms. It's really hard to conceive of, if they would actually have power, who gets to decide exactly what God's law says in all of these circumstances. But frankly, that's a scenario I really don't want to experience and find out how they're going to sort that out.
I'm having if you never remember, wrote it down, I can't find my notes. Which of the books defining Christian nationalism by a self-professed Christian nationalist, was it Torba? There have been a couple of these. To your point, though, they don't share theology. What they share is a goal of power. One of them, I want to say it was Torba, but I might have that wrong, explicitly wrote, we have to change our end times theology away from premillennialism or whichever it was to post-millennial. One of them, because what we have now is a losing theology. We need a winning theology that motivates people to vote instead of thinking voting doesn't matter because it's all done. So basing the politics and basing the theology in the politics and the quest for power rather than the other way around.
And that is nothing new, right? Despite what you may have heard from folks on the inside that no, everything they do is motivated by their biblical theology. As a religious historian and a cultural historian, I can say, and it's not that theology doesn't matter. Theology is operative in these spaces, but it is not always and not often even the driving force. And that theology is actually very pliable in terms of what will secure power.
We have over 99 more questions in the Q&A box. We can't get to them all. Thank you for everyone who's submitting a question. I had promised Kristin we'd have her out of here at 8:30, but there are two more things we really need to cover. First, let me tell you about the next two parts of the webinar, and then we're going to hear from Kristin about a new movie she's been working on that is just incredibly important and powerful. So this is part one of 3 parts. This was an overview. What is what is Project 2025? What are its ties to Christian nationalism? Part 2 will be this coming Monday, September 16th, once again at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. It's called MAGA's Project 2025 is Project Everywhere, with guests from Faith in Florida and from Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. We'll learn about the threat that Project 2025 poses, not just at the federal level or in one single presidential election, but also at the state level for years to come. I've put a link in the chat to register, and we'll also share that in a forthcoming email the next day or two here. Then the following Monday, September 23rd, but at a different time, 3 p.m. Eastern, we'll conclude with MAGA's Project 2025 is Project Everything. I'll have that link in the coming days. We're still putting together panelist headshots and whatnot, but that is going to do a deep dive into specific issues for which Project 2025 lays out an anti-freedom agenda. We'll talk about LGBTQ rights, abortion access, climate change, and the death penalty in Project 2025, or how they're at least linked to, if not directly in it. Our expert panel will feature on September 23rd, will feature guests from the Interfaith Alliance, GRIST, the Climate Solutions Publication, and Death Penalty Action. All right, last thing, I'm gonna put this link in the trailer. The link to the trailer in the chat. Will you please tell us about your new film? And then I will share screen to play the trailer.
Absolutely, yes. We just released the trailer today. The film releases September 26th, so 2 weeks from today. This film is called For Our Daughters, and it is based on the last chapter of Jesus and John Wayne, if you've read that book. And it traces actually harrowing stories of abuse, sexual abuse in evangelical spaces, and not just the perpetrators, but also the enablers, the way that communities over and over again, these repeated patterns of actually supporting the perpetrator, defending the perpetrator, and further marginalizing and condemning victims. And we have remarkable survivors telling their stories. Krista Brown, Tiffany Thigpen, Jules Woodson, Rachel Denhollander is in the film as well. It's directed by an Emmy Award-winning director, and it's a documentary short. It's 30 minutes, and it's all set in the context, as my book, Jesus and John Wayne itself, in the context of Christian nationalism, and asking, are these the men that we want to put in charge of our country? And the title actually came from an experience I had with shortly after Jesus and John Wayne published. I received a note from a conservative woman, and she asked if she and a couple of her friends, also conservative evangelical women, could meet with me over Zoom. I anticipated they'd be critical of the book. Right? It wasn't really written to woo evangelicals, but that was not at all what they said. When we got on the Zoom, they said, thank you, Kristin. And is there anything we can do to help? And they told me that we've made our choices and it's too late for us. We can't undo the choices we've made and walk away from the lives that we've made, but we want something different for our daughters. And that struck me, and I've carried their words with me from that day. And so this film is for our daughters.
For our daughters. I'm going to play the trailer. I'm going to share my screen. Holler at me if you can't see it or properly hear it. So leave your mic off so I'll hear you talk, Kristin, if the trailer isn't playing properly.
regretfully had a sexual incident with a female high school senior in the church.
He tells the world that it had occurred. And everybody stands, and they give him a standing ovation.
A jury in New York has found that Trump sexually abused and defamed E. Jean Carroll and awarded her $5 million in damages.
It may seem surprising that a self-professed moral majority would end up supporting a candidate who has bragged about assaulting women. But if you look inside their own communities, you can see how for decades they have propped up men who have abused power and have excused all kinds of harm, all kinds of abuses for the sake of that power. The ends justifies the means.
I will fight even harder for Christians with 4 more years in the White House. I get in there, you're going to be using that power at a level that you've never used it before.
We wake up tomorrow in a Christian nation. Will women have the right to vote tomorrow if you wave that magic Christian wand?
No.
Macho power is not what Jesus calls for. Jesus himself did not operate in that way. Jesus was gentle. He was humble, particularly in his relationship with women. In that way, he told us men what we are to be like.
And I think what we have to grapple with again is that the reality that those of us who are raising our voices are not calling for a departure from Christ, but rather a return to who Christ really is.
Thank you for that movie and for sharing with it. That line about no, women wouldn't have the right to vote if I could wave a wand is chilling. And to your point about networks and this being so big, every year, Faithful America, we put out a list of false prophets who are leaders in the Christian nationalist movement coming to us as sheep in sheep's clothing, but actually wolves. And one of them on the list this year is the Lieutenant Governor of North Carolina, running for governor, a man by the name of Mark Robinson, who, as a public official who wants a promotion, said basically just that he wishes he could take us back to the days when women can't vote. So whether it's in politics or the church, there's a link to the trailer. We'll do your Substack article, including the embedded trailer, in the chat. How can people see this film?
We have made it barrier free. So on September 26th, it will be available online at fourdaughtersfilm.com and on YouTube, free, available. It's 30 minutes. So it's a perfect length to watch with friends, watch in church groups, and talk about it afterwards. We're also likely going to have it up on a platform that is configured for group screenings, either virtual or in person. So really professional streaming process. There might be a slight fee involved in that just for the platform service, but otherwise the film will be everywhere on September 26th.
Fantastic. Well, sometime after the election, I'm afraid, we'll get you and some others from the book back. We'll do a screening, I guess, online for Faithful America members. Tell everyone to either, whether it's that portal or just on your own, watch it at such and such a time, and then we'll get together for one of these to talk about it.
Love that.
As you mentioned her, we've had her on before for webinar. I want to plug one other book, which is out this year, Baptist Land, a memoir of abuse, betrayal, and transformation by our mutual friend, Krista Brown. I was thinking that this webinar was the first time you and I have worked together publicly, and then I remembered we're actually both blurbing the book. So please go read both Jesus and John Wayne and Baptist Land. Big thank you to everyone who watched tonight. We'll send out the YouTube link so you can watch again and share in a Bible study or something. Before we let you go, Dr. Kristin Kobes du Mez, what gives you hope?
Oh, I am finding some real hope in the community, in the movement here, for good. We went through some dark times this summer and in the last few years off and on as a country, and it was easy to start to lose hope. And I am finding hope in groups like this, in people like this. I see so many people around the country stepping up to do what they can in their places. I see so many stories of individual courage. I've worked closely with these survivors, again, harrowing stories, and to see their resilience after it has cost them so much. They continue to put themselves on the line just to help others, to protect others, and to do what is right, and to work for justice. And when I see the costs that some of these people are taking on and willingly, I honestly just find that inspiring, and it inspires me to step up and try to do the same.
And oh, there you perfect. For anyone who wants more, if you're in the DC area, next week, come hear Kristin speak at Test of Faith, a summit to defend democracy. I'm not speaking, but I'll be there. Faithful America will have a table out in the hall with some of the other sponsors. It's just so, you know, when Kristin talks about the movement and the people doing this work, so many are going to be there. So if you're in the DC area, come out and get some of that hope. But Kristin, thank you for sharing with us tonight. And like you said, I get the hope from the people, from the 300 some odd still with us now, the 500 some odd who joined us tonight. You are my source of hope, along with Jesus Christ and the hope in the resurrection. Remember that you are loved. Accept that love, spread it. Everyone you know, no exceptions. Kristin, thank you. We'll see you out there.
Thank you.